afternoon. These guys put a ladder. I'm on the 6th floor. I have a beautiful lakeside view, and I saw a ladder over my window, and before long they put this plastic sheet over my window. I can't see the lake. What's up with that? Go get them. Something else I did today. Have you been to this Wesleyan Museum?
Oh, yeah.
How many have been there? That is fantastic. Remember, as I shared yesterday, John Wesley's history, Methodist history, is a part of Adventist history. So if you haven't, check that place out. You will see the roots of your Adventist heritage in the history of John Wesley and Methodism. Are you ready to get into the Civil War? Let's bow our heads for prayer. Gracious God, thank you for a beautiful day, for your presence with us all this week, in all the meetings, the blessings, the conversations, the presentations. And we thank you for being with us in this 4 o'clock period as well. Once again, I invite your Spirit to be present as we look at your hand in this nation during its great crisis of civil war. Give us insight and understanding, I pray, and your presence. In Jesus' name, amen. So I introduced you to the war yesterday, capturing the essence of my book, A Nation in God's Hands. I'm going to expand that today. Let me just recap the 4 visions Ellen White received regarding the Civil War. We discussed, went over these briefly. The Parkville vision, January 12, 1861, I will share that vision with you specifically today, and we will look at how it was fulfilled throughout the entire war. She saw that it was a terrible war. Her second vision was August 3, 1861 at Roosevelt, New York. Now, the Parkville vision was never put in print by Ellen White. That was J.N. Loughborough. I'll tell you that story in a moment. Her first printed words in the Civil War were based on her August 3, 1861 vision, just a few short weeks after the first major battle of Bull Run. And I will look at that as well. She said some very important things there. That's where she saw the angel come down and end the battle, cause a major retreat by the Union troops at the Battle of First Bull Run. And then her January 4, 1862 vision at Battle Creek, Michigan. This had a lot to say about the way the war was prosecuted and the problems in the Union Army, the pro-slavery influences. This is where she discusses England. There's that controversial statement that it appears, she says, England will declare war on the United States. And critics say, well, that never happened, so she's a false prophet. That's really not what she was saying at all. I unpack that significantly. In the book, she also condemns Lincoln's national fast. He called for a day of fasting and prayer. Why would she condemn a day of fasting and prayer? Well, it was because of the hypocrisy of the Union, supporting slavery while asking God to bless them in their arms. So that is a part of this January 4, 1862 Battle Creek, Michigan vision. And I should say that was published in Testimony for the Church number 7, and then eventually put in Testimonies volume 1. And then her 4th and final vision on November 5, 1862 at Battle Creek. This was titled The Rebellion, and it was published in Testimony 9 and eventually in Testimonies volume 1. That vision is interesting. That's where she talks about Union officers' communion with the spirits, and she also continues her concerns about the pro-slavery influences in the Union Army. So all 4 visions can be read in Testimonies Volume 1. They comprise no more than 30 pages. That's not a lot to say on such a huge, epic event as the Civil War. But these few short words were pertinent, potent, and powerful, and spot on regarding the issues of the war. And that's a conclusion in my book, is that Ellen White understood the issues of the war extraordinarily well, with incredible precision. So that's the 4 visions. These are put in their historical context in my book, A Nation in God's Hands. This is a part of that. You can learn more in the book. Now, what I'm going to do, what is covered here is in the book. I've reconfigured it a bit for a presentation such as this, but also I'm going to share a few things that are not in the book. Because I remember myself sitting through presentations. I always was frustrated when a speaker had written a book, and they talked about the book, and they told me everything that was in the book when I can read the book. Tell me a little bit more than what's in the book. I'm going to do that. I will give you some very interesting details about the battles and warfare and the death and carnage. Now, let me tell you, this is PG-13. Some of it's got an R rating, okay? I'm going to give eyewitness testimonies of the carnage on the battlefield. Now, it's more graphic in my book. The most graphic testimonies I'm not going to share now in a public audience, but I do warn you, it is quite straightforward and graphic. Ellen White saw this carnage. I want to show you how it was fulfilled. So, her first published statement about the war read this way: God is punishing this nation for the high crime of slavery. He has the destiny of the nation in his hands. He will punish the South for the sin of slavery and the North for so long suffering its overreaching and overbearing influence. And only a few other than Ellen White were saying that God was punishing this nation for the sin of slavery at that time. So this was a rare statement in the general literature about the war. What I want to focus on now, I discussed this statement yesterday, but I want to focus on the last part. He will punish the South for the sin of slavery and the North for so long suffering its overreaching and overbearing influence. Ellen White held no punches. She didn't just go after the South. She went after the North as well. The North was guilty. And you can just look at the 40 years prior to the Civil War, and you see how the North repeatedly compromised with the South. You had the famous Compromise of 1820. These are political, historical events. The Compromise of 1850. Numerous political events where the North compromised with the slave owners. Ellen White said God is punishing the North as well as the South for the sin of slavery. The North was not practicing slavery. As you go back years before that, the two sections of the nation went in a different trajectory regarding the issue of slavery. The North moved into an economy based more on growth and building rather than slavery. The South's entire economy was focused on slavery. It was built on slavery. The North moved away from it. Although there are a few pockets of slavery in the North, it generally moved away from practicing slavery, but the North was racist to the core. But politically, they compromised with the South. And that's why Ellen White declared they would be punished as well as the South. She calls it the high crime of slavery. This is one of the interesting photographs taken during the Civil War. That's when photography really kicked in. Some of the first photographs were taken during the Civil War. And this former slave at the time bared his back. And this is an actual, authentic photograph. You can see the horrors of the beatings that many slaves received. I discussed this some yesterday. What I want to do now, I want to share some insights with you from Frederick Douglass. He escaped from slavery, became the most famous black abolitionist in 19th century America. He is all through my book. He is one of my heroes of the 19th century. And he described his experience in slavery. What was it that caused this war? Why was God so upset with the nation? Listen to an eyewitness testimony of a former slave. In his autobiography, My Bondage, My Freedom, Douglass provided a vivid depiction of the horrors of slavery in the South among professed Christian slaveholders. Now, if you read Ellen White's condemnations of slavery before the war in that Spiritual Gifts, I mentioned that yesterday, she in no uncertain terms condemns Christians. She even condemns their prayers. And critics have said, look, this woman, she's condemning other Protestant Christians. She says God doesn't hear their prayers. Look how she condemns other Christians. Wait a minute. She is talking about these Christian slaveholders and racist Christians in the North. Here's the evidence. Douglass said, I assert most unhesitatedly, now remember, he is a former slave writing about his experience, And by the way, Douglas biographies are great classics in American history. Every American should read them. I assert most unhesitatingly that the religion in the South is a mere covering for the most horrid crimes, a justifier of the most appalling barbarity, a sanctifier of the most hateful frauds, and a dark shelter under which the darkest, foulest, grossest, and most infernal deeds of slaveholders find the strongest protection. He then asserted that were I to be again reduced to the chains of slavery, next to that enslavement, I should regard being the slave of a religious master the greatest calamity that could befall me. For of all slaveholders with whom I have ever met, religious slaveholders are the worst. I have found them to be the meanest and basest, the most cruel and cowardly of all others. Douglas then tells the story of the Reverend Rigby Hopkins. He calls him by name. A minister of the Reformed Methodist Church who whipped his slaves for the smallest offenses. This Mr. Hopkins, Douglas said, could always find some excuse for whipping a slave. It would astonish one unaccustomed to a slaveholding life to see with what wonderful ease a slaveholder can find things of which to make occasion to whip a slave. A mere look, word, or motion, a mistake, accident, or want of power are all matters for which a slave may be whipped at any time. The Reverend Mr. Hopkins could always find some excuse to justify the use of the lash and was feared by slaves everywhere. And yet there was not a man anywhere round who made higher professions of religion, who was more active in revivals, more attentive to the class, he means Sunday school class, love feast, prayer and preaching meetings, and more devotional in his family that prayed earlier, later, louder, longer than the same reverent slave driver, Rigby Hopkins. That's a testimony of some of the slaveholders in the South. Now, they weren't all this way. I cite Thomas Jackson, the famous Confederate general, who treated his slaves kindly. He even created a huge Sunday school class for them and taught them religion. But that still does not justify it. It's impossible to be really good in the context of slavery. Human bondage. But this is slavery at its worst. The North was guilty as well because it compromised with slavery and practiced racism. Again, Douglas stated it pointedly during his first speech in the fall of 1841 when he was a freedman living in the North. Prejudice against color is stronger North than South. It hangs around my neck like a heavy weight. It presses me out from among my fellow men. And although I have met it at every step, the 3 years I have been out of Southern slavery, I have been able, in spite of its influence, to take care of myself. So even the freed men and women who escaped slavery in the years before the war, they experienced this racism. Historian Leon F. Litwack, in his North of Slavery, The Negro in the Free State, 1790 to 1860, excellent book, provides a vivid description of how the white Northern church expressed their belief in the inferiority of their black parishioners. Now, I'm going to read this quote by this historian. He uses some terms that are offensive. I don't even like to hear the term, but I'm going to read it to you because it is a part of history. This is what African Americans, freed slaves, experienced in the North. In white society, the church possessed great social as well as spiritual importance. To preserve proper decorum, church officials assigned an inconspicuous position to their colored parishioners. When attending services, Negroes found themselves segregated, either in an African corner, as it was labeled, or, and I hate to even say the term, but it is the ugly part of our history, nigger pew, seats marked BM, black members, or aloft in nigger heaven. The Sabbath schools, they called their Sunday school Sabbath schools, also provided separate quarters for Negro and white children. Religious bodies which offered the Lord's Supper generally compelled Negroes to wait until the whites had partaken of the bread and wine. These are Christian churches. Who would have believed it, a French traveler asked? Ranks and privilege in Christian churches. And this drew a vehement condemnation, a prophetic oracle of judgment from Ellen White. She said this before the war. Of such professed Christians, Ellen White wrote, their profession, their prayers, and their exhortations are an abomination in the sight of God. That's the context for this statement. A wonderful thing happened in my life when I was converted. As I've shared earlier this week, I was converted to Adventism through an evangelistic series conducted by Kenneth Cox. And I grew up in the United Methodist Church, so I have a Methodist background. I'd grown up hearing about the Lord, but I never really embraced Him until I began attending these meetings. And I accepted Christ in my heart for the first time. Something wonderful happened. Now, I grew up in Alabama. That was the original seat of the Confederacy. And my ancestors were Confederate soldiers. One, a high-ranking officer. So I grew up in this atmosphere of racism. And even in the public schools I attended before I went to an Adventist school, I remember the fights between the blacks and the whites and riots and so forth. And so I had this embedded in me. At my conversion, all racism disappeared. It was gone. I'll never forget that it was gone. I've never had a smidgen of it since then. Now, I've often wished He would have taken selfishness away and impatience and things like that. That really would have made my life easier, but those sins the Lord has left me to battle with. But racism, gone. I thank God for that. When I was a young pastor, after seminary, I was in a small church district in a conference not too far from here. And I won't tell you the church, the location, but I'll never forget this experience. It was in a small church, and I was preaching, and it was in the wintertime, and in this particular area, they had tree planters that would come in during the winter, and it was run by Adventist companies, and so I'd get new visitors in during the winter. And I was preaching in that little church, and a black family walked in and sat down. And I thought that was great. I continued preaching. I'll never forget. Half that little white church stood defiantly to their feet and stormed out the back. The next week, young and experienced as I was, I preached them to the bowels of hell. I mean, I put them deep in hell. And here, years later, after ministry and teaching, preaching, if I were to experience that again, I wouldn't change a thing. Except maybe one thing. I would take my book on the Civil War and Ellen White, and I would throw it down to them and say, read that. There is no place for racism in God's church. Amen. But I've seen it, even in recent years. We must search our hearts and let God cleanse it of this sin. It's a sin of sins. Racism is a stench in the nostrils of God. And you and I should never tolerate it in God's house, among God's people. We must speak up, call it for what it is, and never let it continue. In 1858, Ellen White gave a warning of coming retribution. This is on the eve of the war. She said, prophetically, God's anger will not cease until He has caused the land of light to drink the dregs of the cup of His fury. And until He has rewarded Babylon double The imagery here is from Revelation. Reward her even as she rewarded you. Double unto her double according to her works. In the cup which she hath filled. Filled to her double. The land of light, of course, is America. Our pioneers loved America. They had some issues with it, of course, but they knew in general it was the best country in the world. It was the land of light, yet she calls it into judgment here. And perhaps the rewarded unto Babylon double, double unto double. Maybe that was punishment on both the north and the south, or it could be just double intensity of punishment on the nation. Either way it applied, because the nation was about to experience horrific bloodshed. This was a prophetic warning, generalized, but indicating that something of epic proportion was about to happen. God's anger will not cease much longer. It will not cease until he has exercised his punishment, that is. So that brings us up to January 12, 1861, the Parkville, Michigan vision. This occurred on the eve of secession. South Carolina and several other states had already seceded. The drum beats of war were in the background, although most of the nation did not hear them that way. On this day, it was a dedication for the little Parksville, Michigan church, and all the leaders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church were there. Ellen White, James White, Uriah Smith, J. and Loughborough, they were all there. And they went through the ceremony of dedicating the church and presenting messages and prayer and praise. Ellen White got up to say a few words, and she went into vision. And when she came out of vision, she shared what she had seen. She never put this vision in print. But J. and Loughborough was there, and he kept a detailed diary of events over the years. And eventually this would show up in his books that are chronicles of Adventist experience. And he recorded what she wrote. And years later, actually 30 years after this, he would publish it in his book. As she shared these words, Loughborough remembers people in the audience shaking their heads. Michigan was a strong Republican state. And there were a lot of Republican leaders, the newly Republican Party that supported Lincoln. And the Republicans really thought that all the events happening in the South, the secession, that was just South Carolina whining again, as they had done over the years. And so they shook their heads. This is not going to happen. Here is what they heard, according to Loughborough's account. There is not a person in this house, referring to the little church, who has even dreamed of the trouble that is coming upon this land. People are making sport of the secession ordinance of South Carolina. But I have just been shown that a large number of states are going to join that state, and there will be a most terrible war. That's probably when people were shaking their heads. In this vision, I have seen large armies of both sides gathered on the field of battle. I heard the booming of the cannon and saw the dead and dying on every hand. Now, the last warfare Americans had experienced was the War of 1812. But this level of carnage was beyond their ken. Then I saw them rushing up, engaged in hand-to-hand fighting. And Loughborough put in brackets here, bayoneting one another, which did happen as the war progressed. Then I saw the field after battle, all covered with the dead and dying. That had not been experienced before in American history. Fields covered with the dead and dying. Then I was carried to prisons, and I saw the sufferings of those in want, who were wasting away. Then I was taken to the homes of those who had lost husbands, sons, or brothers in the war. I saw their distress and anguish. Then, looking slowly around the house, she said, "There are those in this house who will lose sons in that war." Now, a year later, Loughborough went back to that church after the war was underway, and he was talking about spiritual gifts, and he referred back to this vision, and you notice several men had their faces in handkerchiefs weeping. Their sons had been killed in battle. One son was in a southern prison. Very interesting story. Let's look back at the historical context and see how this was fulfilled. Before the vision, December 20, 1860, that's the date that South Carolina seceded. There's a drawing of the event. The formal signing took place in Institute Hall during the evening of December 20, while all of Charleston celebrated. Placards announced the news, church bells rang, cannons roared, the governor and public officials appeared. When the signing was complete and South Carolina was declared to be a free and independent country, the cheers of the whole assembly continued for some minutes while every man waved or threw up his hat and every lady waved her handkerchief. They believed they were starting a new revolution, separating from the Union. They even declared now the relationship between South Carolina and the United States is broken. The Union is no longer a union anymore, and they were proud of it. And as I've read other writings about their celebrations, you can't help but think, just a few years later, Sherman would march through the Carolinas and destroy it. Those people celebrating would lose their lives. The city would be in ruins. It was all related to God's judgment, but I'm jumping ahead. Within weeks after Carolina's secession, 6 other lower South states left the Union. Mississippi, and now this is before Ellen White's vision, in Parksville. Mississippi, January 9, Florida, January 10, and Alabama, my home state, January 11. Then on January 12, she had a Parkville vision. Now, she probably didn't have the knowledge that Mississippi, Florida, and Alabama, just the days before, had seceded. Of course, they didn't have internet in that day, and so news didn't travel fast. And even if she did have that knowledge, the focus was on South Carolina. That had really begun the wave of secession. So then on January 12, she declared that a large number of states would secede, and there would be a most terrible war. After the vision of January 12, Georgia seceded January 19, Louisiana seceded from the Union on January 26, Texas on February 1. And then Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4. Now, I should say at that point you had a 7-state confederacy. And that 7-state confederacy, it was the lower southern states. It was not a strong opponent to the Union at that time. Those southern states, they could wage war, but they would have been easily defeated by the Union, the northern states, if that had been how the Civil War was fought. Between February 4 and March 11, those 7 states formed a confederacy and established the Confederate Constitution. They used the original Constitution as a blueprint and pretty much copied it. The Confederate Constitution is very similar to the original Constitution. That's why they were able to complete it in a shorter period than it took to create our original Constitution. But there were some small changes, but they were big changes, significant, and it had to do with slavery. Our original Constitution, while it had slave clauses, it didn't mention slavery explicitly and promote it explicitly. This Confederate Constitution made it very clear that slavery was the foundation to their society, to their confederacy. Shortly after the adoption of the permanent Constitution, Vice President Alexander Stephens declared to an audience in Savannah, Georgia, that the Confederate government's foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his normal condition. So, this new Confederacy and its Constitution declared that slavery was at the foundation of its government. And that very declaration itself would be its eventual downfall. So things escalated. I cover the history in some detail in the book. So we go to April 12, 3 months to the day after Ellen White received her Parkville vision, which she saw a terrible war. And you have the shelling of Fort Sumter, the official beginning of the hostilities. Ironically, no human life was lost during the shelling of Fort Sumter in the Charleston harbor. but that was the official beginning of the war. There was a few skirmishes after that. In the spring, on April 15, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. Now, I want you to know the state of things, all right? You see the map. The red states, of course, are the northern states. The blue states, that's the seven-state Confederacy. But even by the time of the shelling of Fort Sumter, you had these states in between. You have the upper southern states here in the gray, and then the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. They never joined either side. Lincoln wrestled to get these states to join the Union over the time. So they were a very interesting part of backdrop to the Civil War. But what happened, Lincoln called for volunteers from all the northern states, and at that time, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, these places were still considered part of the Union. So Lincoln was calling for volunteers from these states to go and fight the southern states. And those upper southern states, particularly Virginia and North Carolina, they said, wait a minute, we're not going to send our men to fight our brothers in the South. And by the way, these were slaveholding states in the gray. We're not going to send our own men to fight our brothers in the South. No. Hence, you have the second wave of secession. And these 4 states seceded. Then you have an 11-state confederacy. But Virginia in particular, Virginia and North Carolina, they had the weight of power. The great generals who would fight for the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, they came from Virginia. Virginia had most of the mules. Mules were the power in the Civil War. You had to have mules to pull the artillery and to fight a war. And the majority of the mules were in these states. And the majority of the wealth. And if you know the history, to honor Virginia joining the Confederacy, they moved the capital of the Confederacy from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. So now the Confederacy was a major threat to the United States. It was in a position to wage a serious war, and that it did. The New York Times had already dogmatized after Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops. Whatever war there is may easily be made a war at sea, a war of blockades, a war having for its sole object the protection of American property and preservation of American commerce. In other words, this war will be over very soon. There won't be hostilities on the land. It'll be on the sea and so forth and on the Mississippi. On May 4, Harper's Weekly editorially concluded that if Abraham Lincoln is equal to the position he fills, this war will be over by January 1862. This was in contrast to Ellen White's forecast of a long, terrible war. The majority of Americans believed, okay, we've got war now, but it's going to be over soon. We will whip those rebels in the South. Of course, the rebels said, we can take those Yankees easy. That was the attitude on both sides. Everything changed at the Battle of First Bull Run, the first major bloodletting in the Civil War. July 21, 1861. This is when you have the major retreat by the Union. Ellen White saw the angel come down and end the battle. Fascinating story, discussed in great detail in a chapter in my book, where she saw the angel come down. Then after this, several weeks after the war, the North, or the Battle of Bull Run, First Bull Run, the North, they were reeling from this loss. They were fearful that the Confederacy might come and take Washington. But then their resolve strengthened. And they began to rebuild and were determined, we're going to take the Confederacy. We're going to do it quickly. But Ellen White wrote and said during that time, I was shown that many do not realize the extent of the evil which has come upon us. They have flattered themselves that the national difficulties would soon be settled and confusion and war end. But but all will be convinced that there is more reality in the matter than was anticipated. Many have looked for the North to strike a blow and end the controversy, but that would not happen. So, hope became a trademark of the North in the fall of 1861. There was reorganization of the army under General George McClellan, who was a brilliant organizer, one of the more famous generals of the Civil War, one of the worst generals of the Civil War. He could organize an army quite well, but he didn't know how to really make it fight. He did make it fight on occasion, but he refused to destroy his enemy. And there's some reasons behind that. I get into that in the book. This autumn period renewed the public appetite for a short, victorious war. But Ellen White had not changed her mind by February 1862. So what she did here, she recast the Parkville vision in written form. This is in that Battle Creek vision. She published this with that Battle Creek vision in the winter of 1862. Now, interestingly, if you look at the progression of Civil War battles, the horror of Civil War battles did not really kick in until the spring of 1861. So she publishes this in February of 1862. Here's what she said. You'll notice a connection in the language here with the Parkville vision. I saw greater distress, but here she adds new terms. She says, I saw greater distress in the land than we have yet witnessed. I heard groans and cries of distress and saw large companies in active battle. I heard the booming of the cannon, the clash of arms and the hand-to-hand fight, and the groans and prayers of the dying. Now, they had already experienced that in the Battle of Bull Run. But she says, greater distress, greater intensity. That's the keynote in this statement here. Yes, they've heard the booming of the cannon already, but it's going to happen in a more intense way than we have experienced. The ground was covered with the wounded and the dead. I saw desolate, despairing families and pitching want in many dwellings. Even now, many families are suffering want, but this will increase. See, everything will increase. The faces of many looked haggard, pale, and pinched with hunger. So she describes an intensity of what she described in Parkville. They had seen some carnage already, but that's nothing, she says, compared to what's about to happen. But all through the North, they were looking for one decisive battle to end it. And at the time this was published, McClellan had trained, had raised up a huge army in Washington, but they were sitting there. And everybody was waiting for McClellan to move. And Lincoln was telling McClellan, move, get the army moving. McClellan refused to do it. He finally moved it, but that was a part of Lincoln's frustration with many of his generals. Lee E. Busey, who wrote a master's thesis on the Ellen White and the Civil War, he plowed the first ground. I have built on his helpful study. He wrote, a year had elapsed since her Parkville statements, and up to 1862, it would seem that reality had not reached her initial concept of the war's immensity. Before long, he rightly concludes, it became evident that time and events favored her side. So, 1862 was the beginning of horrors. So we begin with the Battle of Shiloh. Shiloh changed everything. They thought Bull Run was bad. Shiloh had twice as many casualties. So now I'm going to go through several major battles, give you some statistics, the number of casualties, and then listen to eyewitness testimonies about the carnage after the battle. This battle was fought on April 6 through 7, 1862. The Union forces were 65,000. That's about how many fought in the Battle of First Bull Run total. And the Confederate forces were 44,000 plus. The estimated casualties, 23,000 plus casualties in 2 days. That's something we can't comprehend today. In our battles, it's not that much. But this was typical. Shiloh. This particular picture is the hornet's nest. I was just visiting Shiloh. It's only 4 hours from Chattanooga. And I was there walking through the battlefield, and I spent a lot of time in various places, particularly the hornet's nests. They call it the hornet's nest because the bullets were flying so intensely. The soldier said it sounded like hornets buzzing around you. So they called it the hornet's nest. And I remember reading about other Civil War authors as they walk through Shiloh. There's something haunting about Shiloh. You go out and you're in these deep woods and you see these monuments and you know that there was the ground you're walking upon was covered with dead bodies. And I experienced that haunting myself. During the night of April 6th, one Confederate soldier recalled, "At midnight, a heavy rain set in, accompanied by peal after peal of thunder, together with the roaring of the cannon and the bursting of shell. The flashes of lightning revealed the ghastly features of the dead. Oh, what a night of horrors that was." William T. Sherman, who would rise to prominence later in the war, described the scene in a letter to his wife. "The scenes on this field would have cured anybody of war. Mangled bodies, dead, dying, in every conceivable shape, without heads, legs, and horses." Major General Grant, who was the major at the time, who had become the general-in-chief at the last year of the war, he provided a description of the battlefield. "I saw an open field in our possession on the second day, over which the Confederates had made repeated charges the day before, so covered with dead that it would have been possible to walk across the clearing in any direction, stepping on dead bodies without a foot touching the ground." And I had that quote, and I spoke with the park rangers, and I said, "Tell me where this field is." And they told me how to get there, and I went to this field. And it was a very sobering experience. Lieutenant William C. Thompson in the Confederacy described the hospital scene. "The heart-rending scene at the hospital is," and their hospitals were often just tents or sometimes an open space in the woods. "The heart-rending scene at the hospital is one I would like to forget. Piles of dead soldiers were all around, and lying in rows were others who were dying. Doctors and their assistants were moving among the wounded, examining and aiding those who were not beyond help. The screams from the operating table resounded through the woods, for the surgeons were taking off arms and legs of a succession of men carried to them." In that day, when a soldier was shot in the arm or the leg, they didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know how to help him, so they amputated it. And they would often pile. Any Civil War hospital had piles of feet and arms, legs, ankles, in piles by the tables of the surgeons. Shiloh destroyed the North's notion of a quick Union victory. Both sides now realized that they were in for a long, hard, bloody war. Shiloh, according to James McPherson, renowned Civil War historian, Shiloh launched the country onto the flood tide of total war. Hard war, as they would call it. Grant articulated the feeling of most in the North. "Up to the Battle of Shiloh, I, as well as thousands of other citizens, believed that the rebellion against the government would collapse suddenly and soon if a decisive victory could be gained over any of its armies. But afterward, I gave up idea of saving the Union except by complete conquest. That is, he realized there's only one way. We can't go down to the Mississippi and cut them off. We've got to invade them on land. We've got to invade the Confederate heartland." And in the end, that's precisely what happened. But to do so would cause massive loss of life. Again, Ellen White's words 2 months earlier, "I was shown that many do not realize the extent of the evil which has come upon us. I saw greater distress in the land than we have yet witnessed. I heard groans and cries of distress. I saw large companies in active battle." These words met their fulfillment in Shiloh and thereafter. One of the most well-known battles, significant battles, is Antietam. I really suppose I should say probably the most well-known battle is Gettysburg. That's the big battle that everyone is aware of. And Gettysburg, without question, was a significant battle. It had the most casualties. But Gettysburg was a tactical victory, not a strategic victory. Because Meade, the general, northern general, did not destroy Lee's armies. So Shiloh, while it's well known, and if you go visit the Shiloh battlefield, you ought to do that for a vacation sometime. It's an amazing experience. But Shiloh was not a major important win for the Union. But Antietam was the first major turning point in the war. But let's talk about Antietam in terms of its carnage. It was a one-day battle. September 16th through 18th, it was on September 17th that the battle took place. Union forces were 75,000. So we're taught when Ellen White described large companies on the battlefield, this is what she was talking about. Confederate forces, 35,000. And the fact that Robert E. Lee could survive with much less numbers than the North in a battle shows to his talented generalship. I mean, Grant and Lee, they were incredible generals. Estimated casualties, 26,000 plus. It's estimated that on that day, 6,500 to 7,000 were killed in action, one day. Approximately one man died every 5 to 6 seconds of the battle. Now, this is one-day battle, the bloodiest day of battle in American military history. The intensity of combat is incomparable in the annals of American arms. James McPherson said this: "The number of casualties in one day at the Battle of Antietam was nearly 4 times the number of casualties on D-Day, June 6, 1944. The number of battle deaths in one day at Antietam exceeded the total battle deaths in all the other wars the United States fought in the 19th century. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, that's the end of the 19th century, and the Indian Wars. All the deaths in those wars were less than the deaths in this one day at the Battle of Antietam, by Antietam Creek." And that's another battlefield you really want to visit in vacation, is the battlefield of Antietam. A Union officer described a pile of bodies as looking at the picture of all that is sickening, harrowing, horrible. Oh, what a terrible sight. So this is the day after the battle. The carnage after this battle was unbelievable. Some of the first pictures from the battlefield were taken at Antietam. Here's a picture at the church. Now, this is taken several days after the battle. They had removed some of the bodies. All right, keep in mind these pictures are days after the battle. That's the little Dunker Church. You can see its destruction now. It's rebuilt to how it looked before the battle. But it received some shelling. Here's the fence on Hagerstown Road. This particular picture is in my book. Again, this is after the battle. Immediately after the battle, the bodies were much more dense. Many had already been removed. Here is what was called Bloody Lane, where the Confederates sat and fought and died in this trench. They called it Bloody Lane. That's how it looks today at the Battle of Antietam. A New York regiment's lieutenant colonel described the aftermath of Bloody Lane. "In the road, the dead covered the ground. It seemed as I rode along that it was the valley of death. I think that in the space of less than 10 acres lay the bodies of 1,000 men and as many wounded." Union Lieutenant George F. Noyes said, "No matter in what direction we turned, it was all the same shocking picture, awakening awe rather than pity, benumbing the senses rather than touching the heart, glazing the eye with horror rather than filling it with tears." Captain Emory Upton of the 2nd U.S. Artillery recalled, "I have heard of the dead dying in heaps, but never saw it till this battle. Whole ranks fell together." Union officer David H. Strother observed, "Heads and faces hideously swelled, covered with dust until they looked like clods. Their attitudes were wild and frightful." When he says attitudes, he means the facial expressions. And here's some information that's not in the book, but this is graphic. Now, back on whole ranks fell together. Ranks were often composed of men from a particular area. And many men from a certain city, a small town, would volunteer, and they would fight together side by side. And in this battle, as in others, when an entire rank of men from the same town were shot down, there were no more men in that town. That happened frequently. Now, the wild and frightful attitudes, you read about, I've read several books about soldiers in battle in the Civil War and their testimonies, and the soldiers described when they were charging in battle, the more experienced ones, what they called battle rage. Battle rage, when you hear the scream of your fellow soldiers and you're charging and you know your mission is to kill the enemy, you get caught up in this frenzy and you don't care about yourself anymore. Now, soldiers who went into battle for the first time, they were terrified. Many would run. But seasoned veterans got to the point where they didn't care whether they were shot or not. Their mission was to kill that enemy ahead of them. And so they would charge in what they called battle rage, screaming at the top of their lungs with a frightful look on their face, a battle rage. And what would happen often, and this is described, as they were running, charging, in any Civil War battle, fragments were flying through the air. I mean, the air was full of bullets and artillery just flying everywhere. And these guys would charge and they would get hit, and a bullet would hit them in the head and instantly paralyze them. And as they're moving along, they would get hit right in the head, they would stop, and they would freeze in that battle rage. That's what he meant by wild, frightful attitudes. But what happened? After the battle, soldiers always went and toured the battlefield looking for comrades, and they would see their friend standing upright in a charged position. And they would walk up to their friend and begin to talk with him, carry on a conversation until they realized he was dead. So this is some of the experiences on the battlefield. Here's another one that I found most interesting. The cannonballs, when they would fly through the air, it gave an illusion that it was floating slowly through the air. And soldiers up in the front, they would see these cannonballs, what appeared to be flying slowly through the air. And it looked as if you could reach up and catch it and maybe stop it and save your comrades behind you. And so soldiers in the back of the lines describe seeing their friends reach up and try to catch the cannonball. What they did not realize is that the cannonball is spinning, and it has an atmosphere around it. And they would reach up and it would take their arms off. It would take their heads off. Sometimes they would reach up and try to jump and catch it. It would cut them right in two. So those are some of the experiences on the battlefield. What did this produce? Incredible carnage. Bodies and body parts, I told you this would be graphic, all over the field. But this is related to what Ellen White saw in vision before it ever happened. Here's a picture of Bloody Lane. This is some days afterward. You can see decomposing corpses there. It was much more thick the day after the battle. Numerous bodies had been removed by the time this picture was taken. Here's an artist drawing of the charge on the field of Antietam. Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg was probably one of the greatest Union disasters. In Civil War battles, if you had high ground, you had the advantage. You didn't want to be charging or sending your troops up high ground if the enemy was up there. Well, in this case, Lee had the high ground on Marie Heights. And the Union general, he was sending his troops in mass columns up this hill. And they were literally mowed down. It was a horrible day for the Union. December 13, 1862. The Union forces were 100,000. Confederate forces, 72,000. The estimated casualties, 18,000. General Burnside sent his army in formation and over open ground against Lee's smaller force, well positioned on the high ground beyond the town. Burnside had, gentlemen, you might find this interesting if you haven't heard this already, he had his whiskers cut in a certain way. They went down the side of his face and he shaved his chin. And that became his unique characteristic. But then others caught on, and they inverted his name and called it sideburn. And that's where we get sideburns today. Lots of these things like that come from the Civil War era. Thought I'd lighten things up a little bit. Kind of need it, don't we? Fredericksburg. Here's a drawing of someone who witnessed the battle. An actual sketch. You can see the Confederates on the high ground, and here the Union troops. These are the smoke from the firing artillery and musketry. And here are the columns charging, and pretty soon that field would just be layered with dead bodies. The London Times correspondent Francis Charles Lawley, viewing the battle from the Confederate lines, reported on the terrible toll exacted on Union troops. Not for 50 years to come will that scene ever fade from the memory of those who saw it. There in every attitude of death, lying so close to each other that you might step from body to body, lay acres of the Federal dead. Robert E. Lee is credited with making this statement as he watched the battle happen from above. It is well that war is so terrible, we would grow too fond of it. General Joshua L. Chamberlain, who would rise to prominence, and especially in Civil War study and history, he receives a prominent place. Colonel of the 20th Maine Volunteers at the time, was stuck on the field lying between the bodies that night and described the sounds of the dying in his Night on the Field of Fredericksburg. Now listen to this, it is haunting, but think of it in light of Ellen White's description of the groans and prayers of the dying. But out of the silence from the battle crash and roar rose new sounds more appalling still. Rose or fell, you know not which, or whether from the earth or air, a strange ventriloquism, of which you could not locate the source, a smothered moan that seemed to come from distances beyond reach of the natural sense. Now keep in mind, he's lying there in the midst of the bodies. He can't move because of sniper fire. This is all night long he experienced this. A well so far and deep and wide as if 1,000 discords were flowing together into a keynote, weird, unearthly, terrible to hear and bear, yet startling in its nearness. The writhing concord broken by cries for help, pierced by shrieks of convulsion, some begging for a drop of water, some calling on God for pity, and some on friendly hands to finish what the enemy had so horribly begun. Some with delirious, dreamy voices murmuring love names, as if the dearest were bending over them. Some gathering their last strength to fire a musket to call attention to them where they lay helpless and deserted. And underneath, all the time, that deep bass note from closed lips too hopeless or too heroic to articulate their agony. Such was the suffering in the aftermath of a battlefield. And when you had sniper fire from the enemy, the wounded had to stay there and suffer. Again, Ellen White's words in February of that year. I heard groans and cries of distress and saw large companies in active battle. I heard the booming of the cannon, the clash of arms, the hand-to-hand fight, and the groans and prayers of the dying. The ground was covered with the wounded and the dead. So one can see how this was fulfilled with precision as the war progressed, and it would only get worse. As the battles increased in intensity, it was at its all-time worst during the battles of 1864, the summer of 64, Grant's Battle of the Wilderness, and Transylvania courthouse, and Spotsylvania courthouse, and places like that. It was terrible, terrible carnage. Shelby Foote observed that casualties in the Civil War battles were so far beyond anything we can imagine now. If we had 10% casualties in a battle today, it would be looked on as a bloodbath. They had 30% in several battles. James McPherson estimated in 2015 that if the same percentage of the American population lost their lives in a war fought today as in that war of 1861 to 1865, the number of American war dead would total more than 7.5 million. And whoever the President of the United States is, he would definitely be fired. Ellen White also mentioned prisons, which, of course, did not exist until the early months of the war and didn't really become developed till the later years of the war. In the Parkville vision, she said, "Then I saw the field after battle, all covered with the dead and dying. Then I was carried to prisons and saw the sufferings of those in want, who were wasting away." And then in January 4 of that vision, she said, "Great numbers have wasted away in hospitals." This was about 6 months into the war. "Others have been taken prisoners by the rebels, a fate more to be dreaded than death." It's interesting how she said these things when the horror of Civil War prisons did not really happen until the last couple of years of the war, particularly the last year of the war. Both prisons, North and South, were horrible. But one surpassed them all in a sense. It became the symbol of suffering in a Civil War prison, and that was Andersonville. Here's a picture of Andersonville. I've been to Andersonville. That's another park to visit. The whole park celebrates Civil War prisoners war prisoners of all wars, including the Civil War. Andersonville in southwestern Georgia, excuse the typo, was the largest and the most dreaded of Confederate prisons. The first captured Federals arrived there early in 1864. By midsummer, the number of prisoners had increased to some 32,000. But the prison was originally designed to accommodate no more than 10,000. So all these men were crammed into the space. They had to make do for themselves. They had to build their own tents out of what they had. They had to deal with the hot summer and the cold winter. Here's a picture. This is the plaque. You know, when you go to parks and they have the plaques explaining it. This is a picture I took of at Andersonville. Here's how it looked. The men all crowded, and they only had one water source here. This was a stream that ran here. That was their source for bathing and drinking. But it became the place where they defecated as well. All the sewage ran into this stream. It was horrible. Soldiers described when they first went after Andersonville had been operating for a while and it was crammed with all these prisoners, soldiers described, who survived it later on, when they would walk in, their first few moments of being ushered into the prison, the stench was overwhelming, and they would double over and vomit. When the sun would dry up part of this, one physician there said the stench was so horrible it was unbearable. Now, this is written by a Georgia woman who worked in the area, and she is describing a priest who would help the prisoners. But according to this eyewitness, prisoners died at a rate of 150 a day. Actually, recent studies have found it was more around 100 a day. That's enough if you ask me. Dysentery was the most fatal disease. And as they lay on the ground in their own excrements, the smell was so horrible, she wrote, that the good father, speaking of the priest, says he was often obliged to rush from their presence to get a breath of pure air. It is dreadful. My heart aches for the poor wretches, Yankees though they are. That's a Southern girl writing. And I'm afraid God will suffer some terrible retribution to fall upon us for letting such things happen. If the Yankees ever should come to southwest Georgia and go to Anderson and see the graves there, God have mercy on the land. Well, Sherman did come through Georgia. He didn't go through this area, but God did not have mercy on the land. So, Andersonville became a symbol of this horror. It's interesting. Where that stream used to be, it's now an open field, and there are signs, and it says, rattlesnake field. Do not tread upon it. Do not walk in it. They said it's filled with rattlesnakes. Isn't that interesting? I couldn't help it. I had to get a picture in there, so I walked very carefully and took some pictures and jumped out of there. If the statements in the above January 1861 and February 1862 documents are considered to be genuine prophetic predictions and dated before the Civil War really got underway, then they can only be explained as being uniformly vindicated in the events of the war itself. Ellen White's statements give an ominous yet realistic portrayal of events before they happened. That's why I shared these graphic eyewitness testimonies with you. It simply is the evidence that Ellen White described it precisely as it happened. For me, this adventure of writing this book and doing this research has increased my appreciation for Ellen White's prophetic ministry tenfold. And I hope it will do that for you if you read the book. Let me conclude with two key statements regarding Ellen White's Civil War statements. God is punishing this nation for the high crime of slavery. He has the destiny of this nation in His hands. It was true then. It's true now. We need that encouragement today, don't we? And this statement, early in the war, she said, "It looked to me like an impossibility now for slavery to be done away with. God alone can wrench the slave from the hand of his desperate, relentless oppressor. God alone." And as I shared with you yesterday, God alone did it. He worked through all the politics of the war, all the good decisions and bad decisions of the generals. Everything that happened was His intervention in the war. And when Ellen White saw the angel come down during the Battle of First Bull Run, early in the war, that was a symbol of how God would intervene in every major battle of the war, in every major political event. And, thankfully, the Civil War, its result, helped define the United States. The Revolution really established the United States. The Civil War shaped it and formed it into the nation it is today. Yes, we still struggle with racism, but thank God slavery is dead. So thank God for the prophetic ministry of Ellen White. God alone. God alone acted then. God alone is acting today. And most encouraging, God alone in your life. What challenges are you facing? Trust in God alone. A nation in God's hands, your life in God's hands. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for the insight and lessons from this terrible war that punished this nation long ago. But those lessons are still rich and powerful, and there for the taking and assimilating in our own hearts. Help us to never forget what's happened in this nation. Help us to never forget how you led Ellen White's prophetic ministry, how she mentored the church through this great crisis, and how those words still speak to our hearts today. We thank you for the prophetic gift, for the insights we've learned all week long. Move us, Lord, to be good stewards of these writings, and that would mean we partake of them ourselves. So I pray your blessing upon each person here as they, first of all, read Scripture and meditate on Scripture. Then, as they read the prophetic writings of Ellen White, speak to their hearts and bless them, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you. You have been a fantastic audience this week.